Thank you very much for being here, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I had a great evening with dinner last night with Antonio and Yvonne and Hector and Courtney and a number of other people. So it's a pleasure being here. It's a pleasure having the opportunity to speak. I don't know about going after the student who just presented, who really rocked the house. So I think we should give her another round of applause. What is your name again? Yeah. It was amazing, very powerful. So I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing focused on food and housing insecurity, which we know is an issue that affects a lot of our students. And so I'm going to talk about 3 different research studies that we've done, all really looking at the same data, but just in slightly different ways, and then kind of use that to have us think a little bit deeper about how we can better support students who face these issues. And I thought I'd start a little bit more with kind of this a personal story, and some of you may have heard this because I had the opportunity to speak at Cuesta. In fact, where's Quay at? Quay? Yeah. And the team from Cuesta. Frank, those who are from Cuesta, raise your hand. All right. Oh, we're on sides now. Okay. All right. Well, it was a pleasure being there, and so when I went off to college, I had both parents at home. Everything was pretty strong for me and for my twin brother. And during halfway through our freshman year, our father was incarcerated, and he ended up going and spending the rest of his life in prison. In fact, I mentioned at Cuesta, he ended up, his final stay was at the men's colony. And so during that time, I went from being able to call home if we needed something, something simple, hey, we need $10, $5, $20. We could call home and get some support, to basically having nothing. And it was about the same time that I moved out of the place I was at into a different place, and so things were just even more tough during that time. So I went from having a system of support to really no support, and I would go sometimes 2 days. At one time I remember going 3 days at a time without eating anything, just having water. And so if there was a campus event or something along those lines, I was there because it would sometimes mean it was the only time I was gonna get something to eat. So all those pizza events that took place, I was like the pizza king. And so I used to, when it got really bad, I would start scrounging change off the ground, and I would go to Taco Bell, because at that point you could get a bean burrito for 69 cents. So I'd go and I'd get a bean burrito and a cup of water, and I'd be like, okay, cool, I can make it for a few more days. And I'd be fine as long as I had that, because I got used to being hungry. It's kind of almost like a constant. So it got to the point where, in a weird way, it didn't even bother me as much, right? But it didn't bother me as much, but it certainly affected my ability to be able to learn, right? Because you might be able to operate, but in terms of being able to focus and sit down and read a book and do things along those lines, that just wasn't happening. At the same time, my brother kind of struggled with it in different ways. He spent time, basically, we were both in student government, and so our offices, particularly his office, became the place that he slept, because he didn't have a place to go. I lived in a garage. I lived in my car for a little bit, not for long. And so we were students who experienced food and housing insecurity. And so with the work that I do on Black boys and men in education, the work that we do on food and housing insecurity, we do it because it's research, right? We're researching the experiences that we have had and how we know that it affected our own success, and then looking at, okay, so what can we do to better support these students? So I approach this work from that perspective, and so I thought I'd share that. So in terms of what we're gonna do here, there's essentially 3 goals. We might not get to the third, it depends upon how much time we have. But we're gonna examine characteristics of community college students who experience food and housing insecurities. We're gonna talk about factors that distinguish them from other students, and that's gonna be important because it helps us to understand what are the challenges that they face. And then if we get some time at the end, we're gonna do a short table discussion. So I'm from the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, SEAL. We are a research and practice center based out of San Diego State University. We started in 2011 as a minority male community college collaborative looking specifically at Black, Latino, Southeast Asian, Native American, and Pacific Islander men. And then a couple years ago transitioned to a more agenda that was really starting to look at students across all gender groups. And so we have a focus on doing research, training, and assessment that tries to illuminate some of the experiences that our most underserved students have on our campuses. As you can see here on the slide, this is the team of individuals who are engaged in the work with us. They are our students, and they are representative of many diverse backgrounds, and they help us to do this. So anytime I present data, I like to show the people who are helping to be behind this, because we don't do all this work on our own. And then I co-direct the center with my colleague Frank Harris, who is both my colleague in the academy and my brother, practically, in terms of how close we are. So he unfortunately had another thing that he was doing today, so he was unable to be here. He is actually doing an accreditation visit, and believe me, by the end of it, he was like, I will switch you right now. So in terms of the data, in terms of how we collect it, we have a few different instruments. We collect qualitative data, we collect quantitative data. Our qualitative data primarily consists of focus groups and interviews that we do with students, with faculty and staff. In fact, we were looking at some of the data last night. We have focus group data for about 250 students in the system. Many of them focused on men of color, but other groups, depending upon what the campus wanted to when we partner with them. A lot of our work comes from the quantitative research that we do. We have a survey that's called the Community College Success Measure. It's the one on the far left-hand side of your screen. And what we do is when we partner with a college, we take this instrument that we've developed based upon the research on underserved students. It's an equity-based instrument, helps to identify what do we need to be doing to help fill those gaps. And then what we do is it's distributed in randomly selected course sections. So it's an in-class instrument that's taken place that people fill out on paper, and then it's basically sent back to us to randomly selected course sections. Now that's important. It's extremely important what I just said. It's a paper-based instrument that's distributed to randomly selected course sections. And the reason that's important is that the vast majority of research that's been done on food and housing insecurity has been based upon online samples. We take a survey, a very probably well-designed survey, and then we send it out to students, and then we have them respond. Now, the challenge with that is pretty big if we're talking about this population. What would be the issue of looking at students and having them complete a survey on food and housing insecurity that's an online survey? Anybody have an idea why it might be? Everyone's laughing because everybody already knows. What's the issue with it? Access, right? So who's going to complete the survey? All right, you're going to have some major issues with response. So you end up finding two different things in the literature on this, right? Either you find a sample where it shows there's really high percentage of people who experience food and housing insecurity, super high, and there's all these statements that are made about it. And oftentimes, or you find that it's a very small sample, and typically the difference between the two of them is that the one, it was just sent out as a regular email, we're looking at student success, so the people who are experiencing the challenges aren't responding, or it's a survey and it says we're looking at food and housing insecurity, so those students who are experiencing that are making sure to respond. And so you find really some pretty basic methodological errors that I think lead to a lot of challenge. And so you'll find that our data differ from some of what you might see, and so I think that's just important to know. So we did two reports that we have done on food and housing insecurity, some articles, a few op-eds. We have another report that's going to come out. One on the left, is there a way we can turn this down just a smidgen? I think it's giving a little feedback. Got it? Cool, thanks. The one on the left is called Struggling to Survive, Striving to Succeed, Food and Housing Insecurities in the Community College. And we did that in December of 2016. Based upon a most recent sample. And then the one you see on the right-hand side, which is called 5 Critical Facts, which focuses on food and housing, but with a focus on men of color. So just some background data. Just some background data. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right, let's just step back here. Just some background data that I think helps to contextualize what we're looking at. So we know that there's been an increasing focus on the issues of food and housing insecurity. There we go. Oh, yeah.
That's my sister.
All right, we're just going to set this down here. All right. I feel like now we're on stage. Okay, so there's been an increasing focus on this topic. And a lot of it's been because of two scholars in particular, one Sarah Goldrick-Rab, who does the Wisconsin Hope Lab, and Jared Gupner, who does work on students experiencing, Gupton rather, who work on students experiencing homelessness. And they have really kind of set the national stage to really look at these issues, and I think it's important to recognize that if it wasn't for a lot of the work they're doing, many campuses wouldn't be talking about these issues in the same way that they are. We know that a lot of students in our community colleges are low income. In fact, the data we have show that about 56% of students in our community colleges have annual household incomes of $20,000 a year or less. Now, it's important to note that while the vast majority of the students who experience food and housing insecurity are from low income backgrounds, that you can also have a student who's from a middle income or high income background who also experiences this challenge. And this is how it typically works. They hit 18 years old, the parents say, you know what, you are on your own. You have to basically, make it your way in this life. And they, it's kind of like this idea of like tough love and whatever that might be, which is, I'm not discrediting it. I'm just saying though, we do see a percentage, about 12% of our sample are students who would be considered middle or high income who experience food and housing insecurities as well. So food insecurities, we know if we look nationally, about 14.5% of US households experience some form of food insecurity. A lot of the work that's looked at it has been in K-12 education, some great interventions that they've been doing there, such as giving kids backpacks full of food that they can take home on the weekends, so making sure that they're eating. Because sometimes you have a child who their last meal is the last meal that they have in school and they don't eat again until they come back to school on Monday. We also know in terms of the research, particularly the research in the community colleges, that our students who are students of color are more likely to experience this challenge. It all gets based down, and we start thinking about this, to what we see here on the screen, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How many people are familiar with this? All right, everyone in the room pretty much. And the base of the pyramid, right, is our physiological needs, and that we're starting to look at issues of, just basic survival. Do we have air, food, water, shelter, clothing, sleep? And when we're talking about food insecurities and housing insecurities, we're looking at these more base level needs and then thinking about, of course, how does that affect things that are farther up on the chain? And of course, when we're thinking about learning context, that's where a lot of that takes place. So just a couple quick definitions. So housing insecurities can refer to a wide number of things. It can refer to homelessness, which is, I think, the most acute form, and I'm glad to see the legislation that was passed that's going to allow that to be part of our equity plans. That's important. But it also includes students who are couch surfing, sleeping in a car, sleeping in a closet, in an untenable living situation. So it's really just looking at broader forms of what that looks like. Food insecurity, according to the USDA, is really looking at three different kind of characteristics. So one, having limited or uncertain availability of food, or having a situation where the food that is available is nutritionally inadequate, such as top ramen or constant meals of pizza, or having access to food, but the only way to gain that access is through socially unacceptable ways. I think we know what that means. Acute food insecurity is what we look at in our work, which is different than what most folks are looking at. We look at the highest form of food insecurity. We look at students who report to us that they are facing the threat of hunger. Now, I want to distinguish between the threat of hunger and hunger, because a lot of times you'll see reports, you'll see articles, you'll see book chapters that use the word hunger in the title. And I think that is a significant misrepresentation, because hunger is an outgrowth of food insecurity. it is a distinctive factor from it. So you'll see here, hunger is an uneasy or painful sensation caused by a lack of food, the recurrent and involuntary lack of food. Hunger may produce malnutrition over time. Hunger is a potential, although not necessary, consequence of food insecurity. And there's been a lot of research, particularly that's come out of the USDA, that's been like, hey, we gotta be really careful in how we conflate these terms. So in terms of the work we do, we use this model here that guides it. It's called our socio-ecological outcomes model, and essentially it follows a very kind of IEO approach. We look at students' inputs, we look at their experiences in college, and then we look at how that affects their outcomes. The souped up version looks like this. So we're looking at background factors when we consider, the age of a student. We know, for example, in our community colleges, particularly with our work on men of color, that the average age of a Black or Latino male is 28 to 29 years old. So typically, when people think of college students, they may not be thinking of the students that represent at least a large contingent of some of the students that we serve on our campuses. We know that there are societal factors and that some of these challenges can intersect with issues of race and racism, economic challenges. But then when we look inside college, there's kind of 5 domains that we're most attentive to in the work that we do. So the first is non-cognitive, which you'll see me talk about a little bit through here, which is kind of like those affective domains or dispositional pieces. So students' confidence in their academic abilities, their perceptions of the usefulness of college, their gender identity. The academic domain, which is really just looking at their interactions and engagement. Environmental pressures, which is where we kind of situate this concept. Looking at stressful life events, of course, food and housing can be one of those pressures. Campus ethos, which is looking at, do we have climates that are validating and supportive of students? And then lastly, the structural domain, which looks at how sometimes we structure things that end up producing inequity. Sometimes that's unintentional and sometimes it is intentional. And if anybody wants, I'm gonna make the slides available, so if anybody, I'll email them. So 3 studies. So the first one, and most of this is California data, so I think it's pretty relevant. So one is from 7 colleges using a sample of 3,600 students. Another one is using colleges in 3 states using a sample of 6,500 students. And another one is, again, in California, but using a different sample. So this is important because these are pretty good sample sizes in terms of the numbers of students that we're looking at. And I think it gives us a general understanding of some of the patterns and challenges that we see. So just to begin, these are the students in our sample who report experiencing housing insecurity. Again, a wide array of things that can include. So if you see this, well, at least for me, the thing that jumps out at me is like, wow, that's pretty high across the board. And I think it is representative of what the challenge is in many of our colleges, right? So we do know that there are a large percentage of students who are experiencing some form of housing insecurity. Now, if we were to bring that down to looking specifically at one subtype being homelessness, it would be different, right? So that's important to keep in mind. You might also be saying to yourself, wow, there's some groups that seem to have a higher representation than others. So you went from left to right, so white, Asian, we break out Southeast Asian, so that's looking at students who are Hmong, Cambodian, Laotian, and Vietnamese, Filipino, Black, Latino, multi-ethnic, and then the overall for men and the overall for women. Our sample was not large enough to include students of other gender groups in this particular sample, though we'll be doing a report that will focus specifically on transgender and gender nonconforming students. So 31% of men and 33% of women, but if you look here, there's some groups that fall above those averages. What are those groups that jump out to you? Southeast Asian and African American, right? In particular, of course, with the work that we do on men of color, looking at African American and looking and seeing that, shoot, nearly 50%, nearly half the sample, reported they're experiencing some form of housing insecurity. That's pretty high, right? But regardless of that, just to look across the sample and see so many students experiencing this challenge is something that stands out to me. All right, so then we know that this can be a stressor, right? Not knowing where you're going to sleep or having some sort of untenable living situation is a challenge for our students. And so when we look at our data, we also then do ask some follow-up question about the degree to which that is stressful to them. And this is the students who reported the highest end of our scale. So basically it goes on a 4-point scale. So these are people who said it was either stressful or very stressful. And you can see that there's differences in terms of how that plays across groups, but in general is an experience that causes some sort of stress, right? And I would also argue that it causes issues around what we call action control or attentional focus. So students' ability to be able to focus in college when they're worried about all these other things that are taking place outside of college. Here's a quote from one of the students who was part of our focus groups who kind of talked about this experience. Student said, "I have battled homelessness since I was 15. And I was homeless for 2 years prior to moving out here, like just staying at my grandpa's house and he didn't want us there, and trying to stay at my aunt's house and friends' houses and things like that. So when I moved out here, my friend took me in. He was like, you know what? Come out here, come to school. So till a month ago, I lived on his couch." It's not uncommon too for the work that we do, for us to find that students who come from out of state experience a lot of these challenges. I'm going to go a little further. It's not also uncommon for us to hear that in particular our student athletes experience a lot of these challenges, because we get a lot of student athletes who come from other states because we have a great athletic program, but unfortunately we don't provide them with the necessary resources. When we first released this report, we received 3 different phone calls from colleagues talking about how a reasonable percentage of their men's football teams were sleeping on the field at nighttime, or students were sleeping in the locker rooms. I mean, this was something that we heard as unfortunately something that takes place in our state. Let's look at food insecurity. So again, we don't look at general food insecurity, which can be like a marginal level. We're looking at the most acute forms here. So this is why this data might look different than what you've seen. So you'll see again some differences across groups. One thing that might stand out to you, well, there's some patterns that might stand out to you. One that jumps out at me is that you see some of these groups again who fall above this kind of average within their respective groups. So for men, our Southeast Asian, Filipino, African American, and Latino men. And for our women in the sample, our African American and multi-ethnic women, we're falling above that. You can also probably say, just looking at this as an eyeball, well, it seems that this is also an experience that we're seeing a high representation of men in. And some people might have questions about why that might be. Well, it could be in terms of how students respond to surveys, right? There are differences in terms of what people perceive as a challenge. Even if you make things as clear as possible, there's always some sort of humanness in a survey. But I think it actually deals with something that we see as a pattern in our work on men, and it deals with a concept we call help seeking, where we know that men are socialized to perceive that seeking out help will make them be viewed as weak or inferior. So it is not uncommon for us to find that when we do these data, and we've done this now with a number of samples, we see the same pattern pretty over and over again, that the men, there might be things that they could get access to, but they're simply not going to ask. And so we have to then think about, if we have food pantries, right? A lot of campuses now have food pantries. And then they find out it's not common for us to go to campus and for them to say, well, yeah, we have a food pantry, but the men aren't using it, right? Why aren't they using it? Well, they're worried about the perception. And that brings me back to my own experience. So when I was in college and I was experiencing those challenges, there was a pastor in the local area who was aware that there was a lot of students who were, and he was aware of me and my brother. And so what he would do is he would bring us like a box of food. Every now and then he'd bring over a box of food. And I didn't really want to take it because I didn't want to be seen as like, oh, people need to help me. I don't need no help, right? Because I'm a man, I stand up on my own 2 feet. That's kind of like the perception that I had. And so he would bring this box and then he would say, hey, this is for you guys. I brought it for you, thought you might need it. And then it would be the same pattern every time. I'd say, oh no, I don't need it. I really don't need it. I'm good. And he said, no, I think you should take it. Oh, I don't need it. I don't need it. I'm good. Oh, well, you know what? Why don't you take it for somebody, either for yourself or someone you know might need it? Because Luke, you know a lot of people who might be experiencing some challenges. So why don't you take it so you can help them out, right? And then I'd be like, oh, okay. And we played this charade out every single time, right? And I'd take the box, and then as soon as he left, I'd start rummaging through it as fast as I could, right? But I didn't want to be seen in a way that would make me be viewed as weak, and so I kind of put up this facade. And so that's important, I think, for us to keep in mind. We can see that this causes a high degree of stress for students. And of course, there are some differences across groups that stand out as well. So here's 2 quotes from students to help to demonstrate this. I tend not to worry about myself as far as eating goes. I make sure that my son has enough, more than myself. So at the beginning of the semester, usually money is very tight. I don't know how the rent is gonna get paid, but I would rather eat. And it's actually a theme that we've seen in the work that we've done, where students who are parents, students who have dependents, so you can have maybe parents that you're taking care of, or grandparents, or others, and it's not uncommon for us to find that they will be faced with the challenge of food insecurity and then have to make hard decisions about who eats and who doesn't, and they'll make sure that others are taken care of, even if it means that they're not. So they'll work and they'll take their last bit of money to make sure that their kids are fed, and then they'll go hungry, right? And so it was a theme that one of our colleagues, Dr. Marissa Vasquez-Rios, presented on at our last our higher ed association that we have, and talking about this notion of what happens when, particularly with men, when this desire to be a breadwinner, and you're also faced with these challenges. What do? Well, you make hard choices. And then here's another one that comes out, and this is from a student who's a student veteran. I go to campus events and get free food to bring back to the Student Veterans Lounge, or faculty will give me food to bring back to the lounge, because some of us are struggling without nothing. Okay, so when we look overall at our data, we look at the students who experience some form of housing insecurity, and again, it's about a third. And then students who experience acute food insecurity, it's about 12.2%, it's not about, it's 12.2%. So then let's think about what happens when we look at kind of how some of those things overlap. So the first bar here you see are students who experience housing insecurity, okay? So that's this group of students, and the percentage of them who also then experience food insecurity, 26%. Now let's look at these students here who are in red, the students who experience food insecurity, and the percentage of them who experience also housing insecurity. And because of that pattern, what we find in our data when we start looking at the differences, we start finding that of the 2 issues, broadly speaking, broadly look at housing insecurity, broadly looking at food insecurity is the one that tends to produce more disparate outcomes. Now that's because housing insecurity, of course, encompasses so many different things that until you start getting down to focusing specifically on students who experience homelessness, you start missing some of the real challenges taking place. So here's another study that we did when we were like, okay, so let's look at overall, what does this pattern look like? And so these are students, and this is looking at men of color here, who experience food insecurity, right? So they're part of this 12.2%. They experience food insecurity, but then they also experience at least 3 other major stressors. And we asked about 7 or 8 different stressors that they could experience. So it could be transportation issues, which is pretty common. Food pantry in and of itself is a great first step, but unless that food pantry has other types of resources that are available there, it's not really getting at the confluence of insecurities that our students experience. All right, so let's look at some key differences between students with and without some of these challenges. All right, so I'll have charts for men and charts for women. So this is just some basic characteristics. These are students with food insecurity. And you can see here up at top that there's the red bar is those who experience insecurity, and the green bar is those who don't. And you can see that there's a high percentage of those students who are low income, and you can see some other differences that stand out. Another one that's a pretty big difference that stands out is commuting. You can see that's pretty noticeable in terms of the fact that they're commuting more time per week. That's a pretty common pattern that we see. And when we presented at Cuesta, one of the slides that we presented talked about some of the challenges with transportation. It's not uncommon for students who are taking buses or taking trains to have to take multiple buses or trains to get to college because they're from farther away. It's not uncommon for students to be reliant upon unreliable vehicles or to have to get rides from friends. And so those end up producing other added challenges. So we think about a student who's experiencing this challenge, right? Let's say a student with food insecurity. They're likely experiencing some housing insecurity challenges. They're likely then, of course, experiencing some form of transportation issue. They may have a job where they're working late at night. They get to campus and early in the morning, and they get to class and they show up a few minutes late, and an educator says, well, see, they don't care. But of course, sometimes we just don't recognize all the things that students are going through. But in reality, it's a pretty tough experience for many of our students. This is the chart for women. You can see some similar patterns, particularly if you look at income status here at the top, and then the percentage of those who have financial dependence. There's some things that stand out there, and the commuting as well. Okay, so let's look now at how this might affect students in terms of being on track to achieve their goals, because ultimately, if we're thinking about student success, well, how does this influence student success? So again, what you'll see is the bar that is in red are those who are students who experience food insecurity, and the bar in green are those who do not. And what we want is this bar to be high, because these are students who are reporting that they're on track to achieve their goals, whether that goal is to transfer, to earn a certificate, to earn a degree, or a meld of those different things. And you'll see that there's some differences that go across groups, right? But probably the big differences that stand out are what we see for overall, for our multi-ethnic students, and then of course for our Asian students. And in this study, we aggregated Asian and Southeast Asian together because of our sample. But I will say that there was a larger percent of Southeast Asians in that particular sample. So that's problematic, right? Because that indicates students being on track. Let's look at the same chart for women, and then what stands out to me in this are some of the difference between African American women who do and do not experience food insecurity, as well as our Latinas. Okay, the other thing I wanted to talk about, which I think is really important for us to think about in terms of some of the challenges these students face, is that we have found in our work that there's a higher percentage, particularly when we're looking at food insecurity, of students who experience food insecurity who are in our developmental education or basic skills courses. So in the analyses that we've done, we find that if there's a concentration, that's where they are at. So what you'll see here is, for example, up at the top, you'll see the overall bar for, let's take math, right? 71%. Now that's not saying that 71% of students in math have food insecurity, all right? That's incorrect. What it's saying is, of those students who have and experience food insecurity, 71% of them are developmental math students. That's a pretty high percentage. And so what makes, in terms of like myself and my thinking is, so now that we know this, if we're thinking about how do we reach students and target interventions, well, developmental math and other developmental education, like that's going to be a primary site for an intervention. This is just another way of looking at it. This one is just looking at underrepresented men of color. We just took a few groups just to show you what that difference looks like. And these are across different types of basic skills. But what you can see these are again, in comparison to those who do not experience a food insecurity, the percentage higher representation in these developmental areas. You can see it's very high for Black, Latino, and in particular for multi-ethnic students. So why does that matter? These students experience the greatest level of challenge, yet they have the farthest distance to travel to achieve their goals. All right, let's go a little further. We also got to think about who teaches in our developmental education courses. Now, statewide, in the data that we've done, and statewide and nationwide in the data we've collected, we know that there's a higher representation of our part-time and contingent faculty in these courses. Now, some of our best faculty are part-timers, some of our best ones that we have. But we also know that part-timers are less likely to have access to the resources on campus, to have offices on campus, to be paid for office hours, if they do have offices, they're typically not centrally located and they're shared. And so we then also expose these same students with these same level of challenges to faculty members who may be very well-intentioned and very well-esteemed in their fields, but simply cannot provide them with the same level of support, not because they don't want to, but because we have structures in place on our campus that oftentimes prevent them from being able to do so. So, how do these students differ? This is some of our data just comparing students with and without food and housing insecurities. So this is the first chart, is looking at students who experience housing insecurity. So those with housing insecurity, what you'll see here in green these are the things that they're more likely to have that's positive, and these are the things that they're less likely to have that's negative. So a student with housing insecurity is more likely to receive validation from faculty. That's good. Those are those encouraging messages. You can do it, you belong here, you can succeed, I believe in you. They're more likely to also receive validation from staff and to use the services on our campuses. Those are important things to keep in mind, because these are students that we're likely already engaging with and just may not know that there's that challenge. Or maybe we're engaging with them more because we do know that there's that challenge. But I think it does raise the point of being being conscious about the students we're engaging with. Now you'll see the two negative ones on the right-hand side. They have asterisks next to them, and that's because they focus specifically on men. So we know that these are students who also are less likely to seek out help, to feel comfortable seeking out help if they're men. So again, if we have resources for them, they're going to be less likely to use them. And they're also more likely to see school as a domain that's suited for women and not for men. So they develop oftentimes an oppositional association with school. And this begins typically pretty early on. Again, looking at the work that oftentimes we do around boys, we know that boys are socialized to perceive schools as feminine domains. The vast majority of K-12 teachers are women. In particular, the vast majority are white women. So when they engage in the classroom, they typically don't see people who look like them. So by the time they hit 4th, 5th, 6th grade, they typically start to then demonstrate patterns for a sizable population that says, this really isn't for me, because they don't see themselves in it. I mean, if you don't see yourself in front of the classroom at some point, it's hard to imagine yourself being able to do that. And so if Frank were here, what he would tell you is that the work on masculinities shows that by that time period, 4th, 5th, 6th grade, the student who is studious, who's engaging with the teacher, who is doing his homework all the time, is typically the same guy who's being picked on and bullied in the schoolyard. And so we have to then think about, if that pattern then manifests, we also see that these students are more likely to perceive that. So that's harder for them to have a buy-in in terms of that school is worthwhile for me, because there's some of those other challenges that we know. All right, so you just saw here, this is a chart again for housing insecurity. But remember I said that food insecurity from the work that we do tends to show that there's a more adverse impact. Well, this is what we see in terms of differences. It's pretty large. So again, they're more likely to be validated, students who experience food insecurity. They're more likely to use services on campus. So these are students who are engaged with us. That's important. So we're already interacting with many of these students. But there's a whole host of other challenges that we know are also taking place as well. So in terms of being breadwinners, they're more likely to have a very hegemonic masculine perception that I have to be the breadwinner, and that's what I have to do as a man, which can oftentimes create a situation where they then have to make difficult decisions between success in school and success in providing. Help seeking in schools of feminine domain, I already talked about those. So what are the other things telling us? These are students who typically report having less of a sense of belonging with faculty, who do not feel as welcome to engage with faculty members inside the classroom and outside the classroom, who have, in comparison to students who don't experience these challenges, have lower focus in school, are not as confident in their academic abilities, do not see college as being as worthwhile, do not have a feeling that they have control over their academic futures, are less interested in what they're learning, perceive that they don't have access to resources on campus, and perceive that even if they did, it wouldn't matter because those resources aren't really effective in helping them to address the myriad of challenges that they face. It's pretty powerful. And hopefully it helps to serve as a clarion call for us to do more to better support this population. So in terms of what we do about this, in terms of, okay, so all this bad stuff, okay, so now we know bad is bad, right? So now, of course, the next question is what do we do about it? Well, the recommendations that we have are really focused in 5 primary areas. One is around awareness, just being aware that there are students who are experiencing these challenges. One of the things that we learned in doing our work is we actually weren't fully aware of the issues of food and housing insecurity, though we'd experienced them ourselves, until we started doing interviews with faculty members. And then the faculty members, they were telling us how they were keeping like bars of food and things in their bags, in their desks, in their offices. And we started out, well, why is that? I was like, oh, because we have a lot of students here who simply don't know how to eat. So a lot of people were aware of it, right? But it wasn't being as a part of the general conversation 2 years ago as it is now. Reducing costs. For students to be able to spend more money on food and housing, they have to be able to spend less money in other areas. We think about the cost of textbooks, we think about the cost of transportation, we think about the cost of a lot of different things. It's important for us to keep in mind. Having an organized strategy. If we want to do something, we have to have a plan. Food pantries, secondhand clothing, those are important interventions. And then thinking about financial aid, how quickly can we disperse emergency aid to students who are really facing an emergency? And as a student, you don't oftentimes plan to be in a situation where you need emergency aid. It just happens. But then if we have, it takes us 3 weeks or a month to get the actual resource, by the time we've gotten it, it's too late. How much time do we have left? How much? 20 minutes, perfect. Okay, so what we're gonna do is in our tables, I want you to come up with recommendations, being aware of what your campus is already doing. What are some recommendations that you have based upon some of the data that you've seen in these 5 areas that you can begin to employ as a campus and as an individual to help address this problem? So what I'm gonna have you do is do that in your tables for about the next 10 minutes or so. We'll share out briefly and then I'll go through some of the recommendations that we have so we can see what kind of overlap there is, okay? I'm not much better. Okay, so what we're gonna do is just have some groups share out. And then I'll go into some of the comments that I have. So is there a group that, and let's, just in terms of trying to make this as equitable as possible, keep it to, say 30 seconds or less. All right, we're gonna go with this group right here. 1, 2, 3. We'll start there. And we have a mic that's coming around. Just, tell us about the conversation. What are some of the recommendations that you have? What are some things that resonated with you? Yeah.
So we were really speaking pretty globally, from the elementary level really to the university level. And then at the elementary level and in public schools, they do have different food programs. And so we were talking about how could that really be, why couldn't we make that something that happens at a community college level? Or like putting little meal plans, on like the Bulldog card, that they get so many swipes depending on financial aid situations, but it's just for food. So that they're really kind of forced to maybe use that money on something, that is, food oriented. And then at the university levels, those are really like the costs because it really costs that much, or is there some sort of, where's that money going? When you're sharing a 1-bedroom apartment at $1,000 a bed, what's happening here? Like, is that realistic? Is it really what it costs to live on a campus? And maybe
It's what it costs to live anywhere near the campus.
Right, but,
Yeah.
but even with student housing, they're forced to live in these dorms, and yet the dorms are astronomical in price. And yet, are they really getting what they're paying for? And how can we maybe reevaluate, the structure of those kinds of things in order to, make food part of that financial aid plan? So those kinds of things.
Thank you. Okay. It was over here somewhere. Yes, this table.
Hi, we're actually, some of us are from Longfellow, and we actually kind of focused on awareness since we're at a middle school and high school and then juvenile hall. We talked about, we are really effective in the beginning of a school year because we do like the home surveys and, recognize the kids that are like free and reduced lunches or lunch applications. And then after that, we get our list and we kind of move forward, and that's kind of like, we need to like come back to that periodically and see like what changes have occurred in family situations. They might not let us know, but teachers, we have to have that communication with teachers. Like, do you notice if that kid is tired, hungry in the morning? Maybe we need to use some of that money that we have to buy snacks and give them to the teachers. They don't have to hand it out at that time. That teacher can meet with that kid after school, during passing period. Hey, there's some granola bars. Have them make that connection as well to bring up that awareness. Address it to the teachers and staff during staff meetings. Kind of reiterate everything that we kind of really focus on at the beginning of the year, and then it kind of dies down because we're focused on everything else throughout the school year. And that's what we talk, and then constantly have that open communication with all the different agencies. Like, I never even thought to like call the hall and say, hey, if you have one of my kids and you want some background on them, or if you find out stuff from them, let me know, because we're gonna eventually, they're gonna transition back to us. How can I help them? How can I make their transition easier to come back? And then obviously we went down cost, there's a lot of things that we can work on together and bring the cost of things down, whether it's free and opening it to everyone, so it's not like like the kids that are in need of most don't feel like, oh, we're doing it because I need it the most. Open it up to everyone. Oh, we're gonna have an open, like we talked about green salad, have one of our local, like Monty Pack, they do packaged salads and stuff. Oh, today's our green day. Everybody can have a baked salad. Everybody can have, to provide that meal for anyone and everyone that wants it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we give you a round of applause. And just listening to your comments, a few things just came to my mind as you were speaking. So one is just an observation that I've had, and it's really just sometimes just the need for parent education. And so my daughter goes to a school, and there is a boy who's in her school, and I see him walk up every morning with this big jug of Kool-Aid, right? So parents are low income, and there's basically, it's a cheap way to give him something to drink in the morning, and he comes in and then he ends up having lots of behavioral issues, right? Why do we think he's having a lot of behavioral issues? Well, it could be because he's drinking a whole bunch of sugar before he walks in, right? So thinking about how do we talk to parents about that, right? I think that's an important thing. Another thing that comes to mind is a pattern that we tend to see, which is greater issues and reporting of behavioral issues, typically when we get to the end of the month. And what happens usually at the end of the month is usually when money starts to run tight, right? And then food becomes more restricted in the home. And then I also think the other thing that came to mind as you were speaking is typically, well, at least what I've seen as a pretty observant pattern in San Diego, is the reduction of free play time and recess time pretty significantly. And the melding of that with lunchtime, so then kids are making each other, well, do I get to play or do I get to eat? And so they'll maybe take a couple bites and then go play because they want to be able to play because they got to get this energy out. And then we're end up causing more problems than we're doing good because of these policies that we have. So it just made me think of those things as you were talking, so thank you for sharing that. There was another, over here, yes. Here, you can use mine.
So Dave and I had a couple things that stood out. So one was about awareness, and it kind of goes back to what Dr. Malcolm DQ was talking about with institutional racism. So I work at Diploma High School, and we noticed, well, CMR in general, we have a few CMR people here, but we had our free reduced kids were going to eat in the cafeteria, and there was that group, and then we have the cruiser carts that come out onto the quad, and kids can buy their food in the cruiser. So there was this, you know, the haves and the have-nots, basically, and the kids were aware of that. So like you were talking about, I think that certain kids were like, I'm not gonna go eat there because then people will know that, you know, I'm on free reduced lunch.
Yeah.
So what our district did was they brought out the little pads so the kids that are free and reduced could go out to the cruiser carts and just punch their numbers out there like everybody else. And I think that really did a great job of just reducing that perception of who are the haves and who are the have-nots. And so that's a great thing, I think, that went a long way for that. And this one is kind of out of the box. We just got to talking about football players and living conditions and condition of housing and at Hancock College. When I was in college, I was going to Pepperdine my first year. Good school, got through the freshman year, got to my sophomore year, and then I was living out of my Volkswagen van and was like, not a bad thing, you know, I was doing okay. But I was parking it in the Firestone Fieldhouse, and then middle of the night, you can't park here, you can't sleep here because this is a school parking lot. So I went to the dean of students, hey, come on, I need to sleep here, it's working out for me. I want to keep going to school. And they said, you know, sorry, you can't do that. So we thought about maybe at a community college, kind of like a Walmart thing, kind of thinking outside of the box. If you're living out of your car, if you're in between housing, we have a parking lot area where you could come and park. It's supervised by police, by staff. You're not going to get a ticket. You're not going to get impounded, and that just might be a way for students that are in between housing to kind of live and be successful. Just outside the box.
I love it. So destigmatizing and thinking outside the box, love it. Thank you. Let me see, time, we have time. Well, so I think we're gonna kind of end it there. I'm gonna conclude with some recommendations that we have. Now, as we do this, as I do this, if those of you wrote down different ideas, please, if you can hand those to me at the end, and then I can compile and hand it back to the individuals who are putting this on. I think that'd be useful. It might even be helpful to write specific level of education that the recommendations are targeted for. So high school, middle school, community college, whatever it might be. Okay, so just some things that we've seen, and these might be things that you are already doing. Having readily available baskets full of food, raisins, apples, located in student services and convenient locations across campus, so that as people are walking by, they can pick them up and just keep going. These are things that are pretty low cost, they're healthy, and it reduces the potential stigma of having to go in and be seen necessarily seeking out help. Streamline information processes to improve access to institutional, state, and federal financial aid resources for students with special circumstances. That's absolutely critical. We've seen some colleges be able to drastically reduce the amount of time to be able to do that. Contract with shuttle services and transportation agencies to reduce the cost of commuting. Again, it's thinking about how can we reduce costs in certain areas so that the students have more time, more money to spend in other areas. Establish a campus food pantry, and here we go, and reduce the stigma of help seeking by instituting a policy, thinking about the box that the pastor used to give me, that students can take food for themselves or someone they believe is in need. Okay? Expand food pantry services to also include free secondhand clothing. One of our close partners that we work with, San Diego Mesa College, they did that. They have the Sparks Kitchen, which also has secondhand clothing. So in particular, what they do is they prioritize clothing for job interviews, because you know if a student is going to be able to go and they're going to be able to get a job, so they can help to create a better, different situation for themselves. You have to be able to show up and be visible in a certain way to represent yourself, so you have a greater likelihood of getting that job. So they're doing that. Operate financial aid advising using a financial counseling model that learns about students' needs and connects them with the community resources to address it. One of our colleges that we partnered with, they made food vouchers available for bookstores, cafeteria, to reduce costs on campus. I will say this, that the only challenge with that is that after 3 months of running the program, it went bankrupt because they had no idea how great the need was. So thinking about how you would actually do that, and so a lot of campuses that are doing this, they do it as more of like an extreme emergency thing, and it's very limited in terms of how they make it available, but just think about what that might look like. Probably the most important recommendation, provide space on campus to community organizations, faith-based, business, county, city, nonprofit that provide resources to individuals experiencing challenges. Why is that? If a third of our students are experiencing some form of housing insecurity, and 12 to 13% are experiencing food insecurity, and we serve potentially hundreds or thousands of students, we're talking about a lot of people, and it far exceeds our capacity to do. So thinking about what we have as being essentially the first step. So let's say we have a secondhand clothing or a food pantry. We've seen this with some of the colleges we partner with. Students come in, they do an assessment, they provide them with the resources that they need. If it's clear that the student is going to need resources beyond that, then they connect them with community-based resources such as low-cost housing programs, whatever it might be, to make sure that they're getting the resources that they actually need. And if we think about it, remember, in particular when we're talking about food insecurity, what percentage of them are also experiencing housing insecurity? 75%. And how many of these students, again, are experiencing a confluence of other insecurities? So connecting with community-based organizations is important. One of the things that we have on our campus, it's a huge resource, is space. Now, space might be limited, but it doesn't take but a closet, practically not really a closet, right? An office for us to be able to have a connection person who people can meet with, and we can basically then use to filter them to different resources that we need, or to provide space for a community nonprofit to come in. Okay, partner with student leaders to raise awareness. Some of the best work that's been done in terms of elevating the awareness has been done by the student trustees and the student governments. There was a campus that we were going to partner with, and the campus was like, well, you all want us to do these assessments. I don't know if we really want to do the surveys. And we were presenting to the faculty senate and talking about the importance of doing the survey work we do. And it was pretty clear that the faculty were going to vote no. Well, it's just not something we think that we need. Student government was there, and they were like, you know what? They're asking questions about these things, and we need to know. And they basically pushed it through, and now we're finding out some incredible things that would never have been known that are taking place. So sometimes, not sometimes, almost all the time, I find that the student leaders are some of the best folks who do this work. So I think prioritizing them, engaging in strategic interventions. You know, we can't have a divide between different departments or different divisions on campus. I heard this in conversation over here, employing open education resources. So textbooks that are online and free, like having that as a resource in your class makes it immensely more helpful for students. And as I learned here, you might even get a standing ovation. And then thinking about this is the last one. Have an organized plan. We have a plan for everything else on our campus, right? We have a plan for IT, plan for inclusion and diversity efforts. We have a plan for just about everything. If we're going to truly be strategic in addressing these issues, we have to have a plan. And lastly, if we're going to measure this, we need to measure it differently than it's being done. I'm just going to say this. If you're engaged in this work, and you're doing an online survey, it's not going to get you the type of information that you need. You don't have to partner with us. There's other people who do work in this area, but partner with someone who's going to give you the real data so you know what's really taking place. And I just want to thank everyone for your time. I know it went a couple minutes over, but I truly appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.